Good. I will introduce our visiting chef in a minute. But as always, before that, let me just remind you a few things. This week, it's about texture and mouthfeel and viscosity in particular. So today, we'll hear Sean. Thursday, we'll talk about viscosity, sauces, molecular origin, room temperature, thickeners, all really fun things you'll see. We'll have lots of fun. And the lab is mayonnaise. And you guys, you better appreciate mayonnaise because it's one of the most amazing things, I think. I'll talk about it more on Thursday, but it's really super, super, super amazing. Why, you say? Why? You take two fluids, and you stir them, and you get something that's like a solid. Isn't that amazing? Think about it. There's your homework. Think about that. That's what's so cool, at least to me. Okay, sorry. I find things cool. I like to share it. So, okay, this week is about viscosity. We talked about this, or we hinted about this before when we talked about elasticity, because really it all comes down to texture, to mouthfeel. And this is not flavor, but it's really super important in how you enjoy what you eat. How you experience what you eat. It's not just the taste, it's not just the flavor, it's not just the smell, but how it feels to you in your mouth. So we talked about elastic things where you chew, or you try to chew. I don't think you chew on these, right? They're too hard. Their elastic constant's too large. We cooked meat. The degree of cooking changes the elastic constant. We measured that. We learned how to measure it. We thought about Jell-O. We saw these really cool movies, right? Jell-O is mainly water. It's really a very, very small amount of polymer mixed with water, yet it's a solid. But there's a whole second class of materials, and those are fluids. And they, too, have different mouthfeels. So a really smooth, thick milkshake, like if you go to somewhere like McDonald's or places where they make really cheap milkshakes, what they do is they add something to increase the viscosity, to make it feel differently in your mouth. It obviously feels differently than milk. It's much thicker. It's more viscous. And that's what we're going to talk about this week, is how to control the viscosity, the mouthfeel, when it's a fluid, not when it's a solid. So there's a bunch of different things. Here's our milkshake, a salad dressing. This also has fascinating behavior, why it has the particular viscosity it does. A gravy, mac and cheese, what you pour on top of that. We'll do a little experiment on Thursday. Here's a soup. It clearly flows, yet it's able to hold these crackers on top. And honey flows, but very slowly. In fact, we can compare how things flow. Water flows very, very quickly. Honey flows much more slowly. And we talked about bread dough. Does that flow? Is it flowing while we watch it? Is it? Anybody see it flowing? I mean, when you look at these pictures, obviously you don't see it flow, but you can see in your eye, you know it's flowing, right? Here it's flowing faster. Here it's flowing slower. Here it's flowing, but it's really super slow. So what did I just say? What's important is the time scale. So viscosity is a dynamic property. That's not like an elasticity, which is a static property. It's a dynamic. How it flows, how long it takes, and that's how we measure viscosity, by measuring how long something takes. So that's why it's sort of cool, and why viscosity is different than elasticity. Just as important, but we have to think of it slightly differently. And in fact, technically, this is, as are all materials, this is a material that is viscoelastic. All materials are, in fact, both viscous and elastic. That's the characteristic of all foods. It's just how long it takes to flow. Some things take so long that they're always a solid. Others take long enough that they look like solids, whereas others take slower and slower and slower, or faster and faster times. And we'll learn how to change the viscosity, reduction. We change it exactly the way we say. We reduce it. We reduce the water content. Starch, making thick gravies, we add cornstarch. It has a unique property, which we will discuss. Emulsions, I already told you that's one of my favorite topics. And polymers, another really cool way of increasing the viscosity. We'll talk about all of that on Thursday. But today, I'm really pleased to have Sherman with us. And so when I say sous chef, you usually think of the person who's running the kitchen in the restaurant. But here we have somebody who not only runs a restaurant, but runs a lot of other things, and he really is a sous chef. And Sean, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Empathuashte, my name is Sean Sherman. I am from Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Pine Ridge is the third largest reservation in the United States. It takes up a space almost the size of Connecticut. But my focus is on indigenous foods, indigenous food access, and indigenous education. And I'll kind of go through to define what all those topics and subjects mean. We're going to have a discussion about indigenous foods. I'm going to try and move you guys really fast through a shorter time frame of a presentation I gave last night. Was there anybody in this room that saw the presentation last night, just out of curiosity? That's okay. So anyways, some of the work that I'm doing is just because I grew up on a reservation. I grew up in a very poor area. Pine Ridge has been the poorest area of the United States ever since its inception. And I've been really focused on trying to understand the indigenous perspective of culinary because as a chef, growing up in the cities, I realized that there were, in the cities meaning Minneapolis, St. Paul, that's where I'm based, sorry. I do have a restaurant called Owamni. We did win a James Beard Award for Best New American Restaurant in the U.S. a few months ago. We do get a lot of attention. I was on Fresh Air Radio yesterday. You can find that recent audio online today. But anyways, moving from Pine Ridge to South Dakota, just thinking about and realizing the complete absence of indigenous anything in the culinary world. There were no textbooks, there were no cookbooks, there were no restaurants out there, there was no cooking shows. You know, we didn't have really anything out there, and I wanted to know why that was, you know, and what did it mean to me. So what I want to do for you guys today is just give you a different perspective. Just because growing up in the culinary world, growing up in restaurants, growing up as a chef, you know, I learned, like a lot of you, a lot of the technique is based in French terms, or in French ingenuity when it comes down to it. But there's more than one perspective out there, and I just want to share with you what it means to think about indigenous foods and indigenous food systems on a larger scale. So for me, identifying indigenous foods, especially where I am today in North America, is just really trying to understand, you know, why there aren't Native American restaurants out there. Like, why can you go around the city and find food from all over the world except for food from right where you're standing, right? And it's a historical situation because people have to remember that North America begins with indigenous history no matter where you are in North America. But for some reason, that history is constantly left out of everything. Our history books constantly start with the colonial history, and then it just kind of goes on from there. But there's a lot more to it because we have a lot of amazing indigenous diversity out there, and there's a lot of indigenous knowledge bases that we need to think about. So the question for me was, like, where did all this stuff go? And trying to come up with a philosophy of making modern-day indigenous foods, and what does that mean in today's world? So the first thing that we did was remove colonized ingredients that were introduced here and didn't exist here before. So we took away things that people didn't use, which consisted of dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, beef, pork, chicken. There's no black pepper, there's no Jell-O molds, and we're just really focused on the food that's really particular to where we might be, because North America is a huge, gigantic space, right? So we just really wanted to focus on what were people eating before colonizers came over. So that became a situation to talk to people about what are decolonized foods, what are pre-colonial foods, what are pre-reservation foods. And I always like to start with just the base of, like, what does it mean? What does colonization actually mean? What does that term refer to? And why is it a bad thing? Like, why are colonial histories not so great when it comes down to it, even though that's what we're taught to celebrate, especially if you grew up in the United States? So to understand colonialism, the easiest way to do it is to Google it. So if you Google the term colonialism, you'll get this quick description. It'll just be the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying with settlers and exploiting it economically, which obviously happened in not just the United States, but also everywhere on a global scale to indigenous peoples everywhere. So it doesn't matter if you're North America, South America, Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii. Indigenous peoples on a massive global scale were affected by colonialism. And it's very similar situations of what happened to indigenous peoples here in the United States: loss of land, loss of language, assimilation, murder, violence, you name it. They faced the same really hardship struggles in a very short time period of human history. So that creates centuries of racism and white supremacy for indigenous peoples all across the globe. Beginning in 1619, as indigenous peoples from Africa are being forced over here to forced labor, that really ramps up in the 1800s. But indigenous peoples were also a massive part of that slave trade, because there's 12.5 million people brought over here from indigenous peoples brought over here from Africa, and at the same time, 5.5 million indigenous peoples of this continent were part of that same slave trade. We have to remember the very short history of the United States, because if you look at the United States in the year 1800, which is not a long time ago, it's very recent when it comes to human history, that we're not much more than the 13 colonies where Ohio is the western frontier. The newly formed government of the United States sets this in motion, called the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which gives them the framework to justify taking in stolen indigenous land spaces, sectioning it, commodifying it, and making a massive amount of money off of stolen land spaces, which continues to happen throughout the rest of the 1800s. Because we're looking at what is the United States. In the early 1800s, it wasn't really the United States. It was just a small, brand new country on the East Coast, with big sites of taking over this whole space in the middle. But there was indigenous peoples living in all areas of what is North America, from the Arctic down to the tropics. And the reality in this time period of human history is that most indigenous peoples haven't even seen European people yet, and most of them are still stewarding the land spaces that they live in. We don't even define what is the colonial lines of the United States today until the middle of that century, until 1848, when the Treaty of Guadalupe finally happens, and it creates that borderline that we know of in the south that separates Mexico from the U.S., because before that, all of those gray areas were part of Mexico. So during this time period, if I can get my clicker to work, sorry. We just have to remember how intense one single century between 1800 and 1900 is for the indigenous peoples of this land space, how much intense violence they're faced. They go through so much relocation policies. California creates a bounty system when they move in the 1850s and 1860s that wipes out over 90% of their population. They do a census in 1873, and are only able to count less than 15,000 indigenous peoples left alive in the state of what is California, where there had been hundreds of thousands of them at the beginning of the 1800s. Minnesota also has a bounty system, and some of these bounty systems would pay up to $200 for the body part of an indigenous person, which, if you do the inflation math of what is $200 in 1860 compared to today, it's a massive amount of money. And that money is paid through states like the newly formed state of California and paid back by the United States. So it is literally sponsored genocide. There's a book out there called American Genocide, all about very direct instances of genocide in California alone, which there's plenty across the United States during this time period. So during this time period of U.S. colonialism, we see a massive amount of environmental destruction. Our whole world changes as entire forests are ripped up, mountains are removed, mining operations happen everywhere, because the colonial machine is in full force trying to reap the benefits of what's there. Because really, colonialism is all about extraction for profit, and without caring about whatever indigenous peoples might be living there, and whatever food systems they might have had, or anything that happens. So we see a really intense destruction of crops and seeds during this situation, beginning very early on. There's pictures like this, which I saw in the Peabody Museum, just showcasing what some of the family daily life looked like in some of the tribal communities here, which were highly advanced agricultural societies, which saved a lot of the first colonists to come over on this side to show them what to grow and how to grow things, and giving them seeds to be able to grow things that were growing really well over here. So the very first president here in the United States, George Washington, one of his first actions to justify taking over some of this land space, because he had been illegally land surveying for quite a while before the Revolution, but he sends out General Sullivan and orders the complete destruction of the settlements, and he ordered the enslavement of basically everybody they could gather. And during that single summer in 1779, General Sullivan sets out and accomplishes just that, and writes back to George Washington at the end of that summer and says, "I have fulfilled this duty. There's not a single sight of an Indian on this side of Niagara." So in the Haudenosaunee language, George Washington is still known as town destroyer in the language there today. But we see a lot of acts. That just sets the precedent for how the United States government takes relations with Indigenous peoples moving forward. So we see the Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson in 1830. We see the Morrill Act of 1862, which justifies utilizing a lot of these stolen land spaces to help develop more universities. So all these land-grant universities have a very dubious history. It's really worth reading into if you're interested in that. We see the Homestead Act of 1862, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871, the Dawes Act of 1887. These are all just examples of acts of Congress that further diminish the rights of Indigenous peoples, stripping away land, stripping away rights, and justifying the treatment of them along the way. So as Indigenous peoples, like my Dakota ancestry that happens in Minnesota, when they tried to rise up in 1863, they're quickly defeated, pushed into a concentration camp right here outside of Minneapolis on the Mississippi River, where they're eventually forced onto boats, shipped down the Mississippi River, forced up the Missouri River, and then trained out to a newly formed reservation called Crow Creek, where some of my great-grandparents are from. And just an immense amount of violence that happens. And we see this violence happen over and over again across, especially in the 1860s. Under President Lincoln, some of the biggest atrocities happen. There's the Whitestone Hill massacre that happens right inside North Dakota. There's the Dakota Uprising that happens. There's the Sand Creek Massacre that happens. And all these things are just really intense with just pure violence against Indigenous peoples. So we also see an immense lot of food access loss for us as Indigenous peoples because we're not only removed from our lands, but so much of our environments has changed, so much of our food systems are taken away from us. So the intentionality of destroying the American bison is an act by the U.S. government, and you can read about it in passages of arguments that the U.S. government was having back then of what to do with the Indigenous peoples who were holding out. And they decided that it would be too expensive to all-out wipe all Indigenous peoples out, so they started removing their food sources and justifying and paying for a lot of hunting to go after the American bison. So we know that by the end of that century, there was less than 500 American bison left out here at all. And it's a very intentional situation because knowing that by removing this main food source that was also a source of tools, weapons, and shelter and clothing for a lot of Indigenous peoples across the Great Plains, that this would be the easiest way for them to defeat them. And there's, again, more instances of that in history where it just showcases like how much damage is happening and how intentional this is from the perspective of the U.S. government. But what's most damaging to us as Indigenous peoples was the loss of our own education. So if you take the moment to identify what does the term Indigenous education means, it basically means the generations, like thousands of generations of knowledge being handed down, generation after generation, giving you the tools to live sustainably, primarily with plant knowledge of the world around you. Of course, there's so much more to Indigenous knowledge, but to simplify it, it's a really valuable knowledge that we should be looking at because there are Indigenous peoples all over the globe who have figured out all sorts of ways to live and survive and create entire food systems with what's directly around them. And it really showcases the true diversity that we have out there in the world. So going through these assimilation efforts where, again, we should have been learning all of this traditional education, but instead we're forced into forced assimilation situations. And it's only my grandparents' era of the early 1900s that this starts. And my grandparents' era, they're forced to cut their hair, learn English, learn Christianity, and they should have been downloading those thousands of generations of really valuable knowledge, and instead it's replaced by westernized and just a westernized education perspective. And so this is Carlisle Indian School, the first of the Indian boarding schools that happens inside Pennsylvania, which is now today a war college. But these kids come from many different nations, speaking many different languages. This is a military-run school, so there's punishments like the kids were caught speaking their own language. They were forced to brush their teeth with pumice stone, which is a really harsh punishment, especially for a little kid. Nobody would enjoy that. These residential schools, these boarding schools happen to be all over the United States in every region, and they also are all across Canada, which they're called the residential schools, and the residential schools were live and active up through the 1990s, so these are very recent. My mother went to boarding school, and she will not talk about a lot of the atrocities that happened there. During my longer speech, I'd play this, which I'm not going to show you this full video, but this is a ceremony that happened in Ontario in 2019, just before the pandemic, where they wrote down the names of all the students that they could find that perished in the residential schools just in Canada alone. This banner happens to go on for an entire minute, and there's thousands of names, and this is only a small percentage because we started researching the land spaces around some of the residential schools, finding thousands of unmarked graves of young children that were buried and murdered during that time period. So the indigenous experience between 1900 to 2000 is not much better because we basically see we're not officially citizens as indigenous peoples until 1924, and at the same time the United States realized they didn't know how to segregate us or racially divide us, so they have to create a whole system for that, which is the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which is worth reading about. We go through a really intense couple decades of Indian termination and relocation policies, and we also go through a really super intense Indian adoption era between 1941 and 1967. This one should be talked about more because during this time period, 1 out of 3 Native children are pulled from their families and put into a non-Native home, which is another form of cultural genocide. So all of these pieces that happened to us just continue to roll throughout the 1900s. We can't vote as many people of color until 1965. I grew up in South Dakota where they wouldn't allow us to vote until the 80s because our own state government wouldn't allow votes from unorganized counties that they said back then, and now they gerrymander everything. We can't have our own religion until 1978, which is insane because the United States always talks about freedom of religion, just did not apply to the original people that lived here. So in post-colonial Native America, things haven't gotten much better. I always throw this out there just because this just happened in the last presidential election where they couldn't even identify who we were. They just called us something else. So I always joked that was just going to be our hashtag, like come down to Awamni, we're something else, So anyways, but for me, growing up on a reservation, you would think we'd grow up with more native foods, but I actually was forced to grow up on government-provided foods, which is the Commodity Food Program, which has a long history. And it's just unfortunately filled with a lot of fillers, a lot of salts, a lot of sugars, and it's just a very non-nutritious diet when it comes down to it. And there's direct correlation between a lot of families who still survive off of that food system and having all sorts of really intense rates of obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, all stemming from this diet that just is not good for you when it comes down to it. And growing up, we didn't even have pretty cans. They would just say things like beef with juices, chicken with juices, pork with juices, which is not that appetizing. But these foods are much different than a lot of the food service operations that we have still today in schools and hospitals and on tribal communities. So Indian tacos, I decided to push back because really, if you decolonize this space, if anybody has seen a fry bread taco or Indian taco or Navajo taco or whatever you want to call it, this isn't actually anything that has anything to do with us because we didn't have wheat flour to make the fry bread dough. We didn't have ground beef. We definitely didn't have cheese and sour cream, and we definitely didn't have weird California black olives. So we can really do so much better because this one piece shouldn't identify all indigenous peoples across the board because we have too much diversity and too much to offer. So understanding indigenous food systems is really the work that I'm trying to showcase to people of what it is and what's possible, right? So to understand indigenous food systems, you have to understand diversity because if you just look at the ecoregions of North America, there's so much amazing diversity out there from Arctic to tropics and deserts to mountains and swamps to plains and so forth. And then when you layer indigenous peoples on top of that, there just becomes so much cool diversity. So this is a language map of North America from Mexico all the way up through Alaska. And just think about all that amazing diversity. And think it would be like to stop at a Native American restaurant or food business anywhere along the way and just to showcase how much cultural diversity, language diversity, flavors, foods, everything are out there. That's how we should be thinking about North American foods when it comes down to it. Because we still have 634 tribes in Canada, 574 in the US, 20% of Mexico identifies as indigenous, and there's no comparison, There's no comparison between colonial settler states and indigenous regions because it doesn't matter who's speaking Spanish, French, or English, those are all foreign languages. English is a foreign language here, and people don't always think about that. So indigenous education is really where it's at. So again, indigenous education is just all of that knowledge being passed down from countless generations, giving us the tools we need to live sustainably with the world around us. So when we're looking at indigenous education, it's taking into account all this. It's not just about cooking. Cooking is only a piece of the puzzle when it comes down to it. So you have to include all of this education, which is all of this, which is wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, whole animal butchery, mycology, salt, sugar, fat productions, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, metallurgy, indigenous history, star knowledge, traditional medicines, Food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, all of those play a factor into understanding how indigenous peoples on a global scale were able to survive for countless generations, utilizing the world around them. So looking at Native American perspective on foods, of course, proteins is an easy one to think about because literally any animal out there is literally game when it comes down to it. People do learn about how Native Americans were able to utilize every part of the bison, but that's just because we had to be extremely resourceful and we did not have the privilege to be wasteful like we are today, where we literally buy something and throw it away moments later. So we have so much to think about because we also had utilized this same perspective when it comes to anything, plants and whatever byproducts come out of that, and other animals. We just had to be resourceful, and we had thousands of generations of knowledge behind us giving us the know-how to do that. So we shouldn't be afraid of eating animals if it's not a cow, a pig, or a chicken, especially realizing that those animals didn't even exist on this continent not that long ago in human history. So we should be open to trying all sorts of things, including insect protein, which is a really important piece to so many people on a global scale, and there's no reason it shouldn't be a part of our food situation in the future because it's way more sustainable. In my restaurant, I'm going through probably about 15 pounds of crickets a week, just showcasing that people will order them and try them, and that's a lot of crickets because crickets don't weigh that much if you weigh them. So, but for me, the closest thing I got to really connecting with my ancestry and the knowledge of my ancestors was really going back into plant knowledge. Because if you just take a moment to stop calling everything a weed, which just means you don't know what it is, really try to take the time to learn the names of these plants. If you want to take it further, learn the indigenous names of the plants, of the land that you're standing on, and the original languages of where you might be. And just start to see, because if you look around, you're going to see nothing but food and flavor all around you, you know? And this should be a major part of our education, is just understanding the world that we live in, understanding how the earth works, understanding how the plants live and thrive around us, and understanding what our relationship with these plants are moving forward, and understanding how humans all over the place, we need certain basics and building blocks to survive. We need something to derive energy from, whether it's carbohydrates or fats. So it's just looking at how other people utilize things. That was a picture of a prairie turnip that we used to harvest when I was growing up in the Great Plains. This is a picture of camas root, which is a huge important carbohydrate source in a large part of the Great Basin through California, Northern California, the Pacific Northwest. In the Great Lakes, we have the wild rice, which is true wild rice, which is not like the black rice that you see in the grocery stores, but something really unique. And just that knowledge of sea plants in general, because coastal areas, they had so much knowledge of not only what was inland, but also off the shores and all the sea mammals and seaweeds and everything out there. Or if you're in the desert where all the plants look like they want to hurt you and maim you, it's important to realize that indigenous peoples had a very close connection with these plants and knew exactly how to eat and how to harvest and saw nothing but food around them. So it's kind of silly to use the term food desert because people who live in the desert see nothing but food around them. They just know how to look at it through that different perspective. Agriculture, it's really important to understand the benefit of how much contribution indigenous agriculture has given to the world, because so much of the world has adopted so many of the indigenous agricultural products that we have here, which include corns, beans, squash, chili peppers, sunflower seeds. And if you look at if you think about, we think we're at the pinnacle of agriculture, and we're really not, because this is very damaging. This monocultural system is ruining soils. The amount of chemicals that it takes to keep up that style of farming, and the amount of chemicals that get into the food and get into your soil, get into your water, get into your towns, get into your houses, and get into your body, is scary, because we should not be seeing these kinds of things. If you see this, you should be very worried, because glyphosate is an extremely worrisome situation that is so hard to avoid because it's basically in every food product that you're consuming when it comes down to it. So we should be really thinking about indigenous agricultures and practices that indigenous peoples, especially in North America, came up with ways to manipulate food. So we have, when the Spanish first arrived in Tenochtitlan, which is today modern-day Mexico City, there was hundreds of thousands of people there, and they had really advanced agricultural. They're growing the same things as Mayans, which are corns, beans, squash, chilies, sunflowers, things like that. And you can follow that direction of maize growth all the way up throughout all of Mexico, through the whole Caribbean, through the entire eastern seaboard past us, all the way up the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys and everywhere in between. So a huge area of North America had indigenous agriculture before Europeans showed up, with all sorts of different diverse ways of farming. This is a picture of a Zuni farm in New Mexico, where they have a waffle system, figuring out how to farm in the desert, same species, and do that all over, for thousands of years, right? Some people might know about the Three Sisters Mound system, where you grow the corn, you plant the beans, you plant the squash, the beans will will crawl up the corn, the squash covers the ground, and it becomes a very symbiotic growing situation. Again, this is a very particular style to tribes in this particular region out here. If you go further west, this is a buffalo bird woman. She's Hidatsa, which is a tribe in what is today North Dakota. You can see the Missouri River Valley behind her. She's using row systems, but she's growing the same things that they were way down in Mexico. There's a book out there called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden. It's a really unique perspective of indigenous agriculture because it writes down her memories growing up an indigenous farmer before she ever sees European people or uses European tools. She's using a buffalo shoulder bone hoe in this picture, and she's growing all sorts of cool diverse seeds of corns and beans and squash and sunflower and tobacco and things like that. And we have to remember that all of these indigenous seeds and heirloom varietals come from very particular places, from very particular people with so much story and culture behind them. We really have to do everything we can to help steward indigenous seeds and diversity for the future, because there's a lot of companies out there trying to copyright a lot of these pieces and trying to control your food when it comes down to it. So it's really up to our generation to help preserve this biological diversity that we are lucky to have. We have no idea how many seeds were lost during the colonial push of the 1800s in this particular area. So using all this knowledge in today's world, it's really just trying to, how do we give respect to our ancestors? How do we look at the world differently through an indigenous lens, knowing that our environment has changed completely? There's new plants out there, but how do we just adopt it? What is our relationship to the world around us, and how can we create a sense of what is modern indigenous culinary food and food systems moving forward? Because if you start looking at the world around you through an indigenous perspective, you're going to see nothing but food and medicine everywhere you look. And we should just be creating pantry items that taste like particularly where we might live, because there's so much food and flavor around us. There's no reason to not make food taste good and taste like literally where we're standing, and find all the ingredients just by standing outside and looking around and seeing all this amazing stuff and knowing what everything is. So, as a chef, it's easy to make plates look beautiful, but we try to keep things really clean and simple. Like this top left picture, there are bison short ribs, there's choke cherry sauce, there's sunchoke, wild greens and wild onions, and it's like all stuff you can find in the Great Plains, Or there's a picture with crab apples, plums, smoked corn broth, walleye and nettle pesto in the top right. And those, again, like all things you can find just around northern Minnesota, in the summertime. Like you can find all those ingredients just by standing there and looking around at you. Here's a picture of rabbit, cedar, wild rice, maple, cranberries. Literally, you can just stand in one spot around the Great Lakes and look around and identify all those pieces right there. So we should be thinking about very regional focused flavors and to showcase the true diversity that we have no matter where you might be. Letting things be really simple. So for us, removing dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, which just didn't exist here. There wasn't even a sense of tooth decay here in North America before colonialism because of the very low glycemic diet that people were utilizing. So we just really have to think about, for me, my biggest goal is to try to get this food back into indigenous communities, because a lot of our reservation systems are still modern-day segregated communities, and there's very little nutritional access out there, and it shouldn't be which zip code you live in to determine how much food access you get and how much health you have access to. So understanding all this moving forward, I've been able to create quite a few different kinds of businesses, like our food truck, what we started with called Tatanka Truck in the very beginning back in 2014. I started my company, The Sous Chef, also that same year in 2014. I also created a nonprofit called Natives, which is an acronym for North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. And we have two main pillars of creating access to indigenous education and indigenous foods. And we're doing basically what the U.S. government took from us, is by removing our own knowledge and our own education from us and removing us from our foods. We're using those two pillars to push back to make things really impactful moving forward. We're doing this through a nonprofit kitchen in Minneapolis called Indigenous Food Lab. We're able to do a lot of research and development, partner with higher education, partner with tribal communities, and partner with individual entrepreneurs and support, just become a support system, because we just want to help develop all sorts of modern-day indigenous culinary perspective when it comes to our food systems, our knowledge, and being able to basically just counter the westernized academic world that's really taken up so much space in the world in the perspective of education, and really showcase that there are other really important perspectives to think about when you look at basically everything that the world has to offer us. There's so many benefits of indigenous diets that we really want to help people get to, because so many tribal communities really need access to this. And we really want to work towards a true sense of food sovereignty and help indigenous peoples take back their own culture through their own food and really celebrate their diversities and celebrate what's possible for their future. Really showcase to people why it's really important to protect things. We have work with a lot of people who try to get big oil out of a lot of really delicate and sensitive wild rice beds and water areas, because water access is going to be a huge issue for you guys moving forward in the future. We have to be very aware of that and think that through, because I keep moving backwards. Sorry. But these pipelines do leak on a consistent basis. This is just a map of pipeline leaks between 1990 and 2011. So it's not a matter of if those pipelines leak, but when and how much damage will they leave behind. And will our indigenous future, our children, our grandchildren have access to some of these amazing foods that we should be protecting for many generations. We really want to push from our community gardens and permacultural landscapes, because we have the way to landscape any way we want to, and we should be thinking about placing food absolutely everywhere to feed all the people that are going to need food in the future. I always talk about lawns being stupid, because they are, and also I hate to pick on golfers, but golf courses are also stupid. There should not be 120 golf courses in Palm Springs to make the middle of the desert literally look like this. If we put that kind of energy into foods, like, we could be really working towards something better. We're so stupid as humans. We need to do a lot better. There's just looking at just the status of things, the largest body of water in North America is the Ogallala Aquifer, which is depleting rather rapidly. We're allowing companies like Nestle to have unregulated access to just sucking out billions of gallons of water a year for the sole purpose of making water bottles, plastic bottles in general. And we just have to be much smarter about what we're doing with all of our natural resources and look at it through that indigenous perspective of trying to save the earth, not trying to exploit it for profit. Our goal is to create these support and research centers all over North America. So we're actually actively working right now in creating extensions of Indigenous Food Lab in Anchorage, Alaska, Bozeman, Montana, Rapid City, South Dakota, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we'll continue to go beyond. I mean, eventually we can cross colonial borders. We can be down in Mexico, Canada, South America, Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, Africa, India, you name it. There's needs in indigenous peoples everywhere to save global knowledge bases on a huge global scale. We also need highly trained and professional kitchens to be able to work in, to know what to do with all these foods that we're able to pull and all these pantry items that we can create. We're going to work really hard to help develop more indigenous food producers through our nonprofit. We truly believe that if you can control your food, you can control your destiny, because that's how indigenous peoples had done it for millennia. Owamni, for me, is a really great restaurant, but it's really just a proof of concept that we can have a very intentional, decolonized, focused restaurant that doesn't have things like ranch dressing and ketchup available, and just understand the land spaces that we live on and tell the stories there, being very intentional about who we purchase food from and why. We even developed an entirely BIPOC-focused wine list just to make a statement about privilege out there in the industry. And there's just so much creativity. So try cooking desserts without wheat flour, dairy, or sugar, but it's completely doable, and there's so many amazing things that we can do for that. So that is my talk in a nutshell. I did that as fast as I could. Thank you for listening. And I hope that we can have a conversation about culinary-focused perspectives when it comes to indigenous culinary. I hope that you guys can help lead some of this conversation and just ask some questions that you found very interesting from the talk last night, of course. Yes, please, just get up if you want to. Yeah, and I guess we have the catch box, but and I'm just really happy to be able to share with you guys, and let's just start with the conversation. Let's go from there.
Well, so I'm curious about the image you showed at the very end where you said, how do you make a dessert without wheat, dairy, and sugar? Tell me how you would do it.
So obviously, it's called a chaga cake. Chaga is a mushroom that grows on birch trees. We're mixing it with a couple different flours. So we have cassava flour, amaranth flour, and a little bit of wild rice flour mixed into that. And we use a combination of hemp and corn milk that we process ourselves. And we're able to make a batter, and we're able to bake it. And then we're able to make a sorbet out of wild berries in that picture. And we also made crisps out of just some maple and some sunflower seeds for that particular piece. And we caramelized some agave to make that syrup on the bottom of that picture. So just an example of exactly what's in that picture. But there's all sorts of fun stuff that we can do. And we didn't need wheat flour to do it. We didn't need the European ratios of what makes up a bread dough or a cake batter. We were able to just play with the food and literally learn it from the ground up.
Yeah, and I just want to point out to you guys, did you notice how much viscosity was in there? Like matching the batter that he was making, the syrup you talked about?
Yeah.
Just like,
The
so
caramel,
there's viscosity all over that.
the batter, the sorbet, and even the crisps, because they start off as a liquid and you bake them and they dry out and you get the crisp out of it.
Tell us about maple syrup. That's one of my favorite things that viscosifies as you make it.
Maple syrup is a really great flavor, obviously. We actually tap during maple season, which begins in the springtime. We tap maple trees, birch trees, black walnut trees, and box elder trees. And we're able to make syrups, and then we usually cook that sap down. Sometimes we use the sap itself, a straight sap, because the sap itself has a lot of amazing nutrients, especially birch sap. And we're able to we've done things like we've made like batches of like cider and stuff out of just pure birch sap as the liquid component to there. But being able to do all sorts of fun things. But basically what you do is you just boil the sap down. Maple has the highest sugar content, so you don't have to boil it down as far as some of the others, but you still have to boil it way, 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 way down. So like this much sap gets you like this much syrup, You have to cook it way down, and it just gets to the right sugar content. And there's ways to read that. I believe it's a brixometer. Is it a brixometer? The brick scale, whatever it is. I think that little tool is the brixometer. Spacing it. Sorry, guys. But anyways, there's tools out there to let you know like what grade your syrup and what sugar content your syrup's in. And then a lot of tribes actually would take the syrup at that stage. They would have kind of a hollowed out tree, and then they would stir it and agitate it until the syrup starts to crystallize, and then they create sugar out of it. Because the sugar was easier to store, because the maple syrup itself will go bad after a little while. But they would make little maple forms and pack those sugars, and they're able to keep indefinitely, So there's just a lot of cool stuff to do with maple. And it's just thinking about what other sugar products. So we use a lot of agave, we use a lot of fruit, we utilize a lot of high sugar content vegetables like squash, and there's just a lot of other areas to get sweeteners from.
So I remind you as we start asking questions, there's probably a lot of good projects here. Keep that in mind. Guys. Julia, you need to help me turn it on. You shouldn't trust me for this.
Hi. First of all, thank you for coming today. Absolutely incredible presentation. One question that I had is that have you done any work with the Biden administration or Secretary Haaland on addressing some of those issues around the food that the federal government gives to a lot of these indigenous nations? Because I think back in 2018, I had the honor of visiting Standing Rock, and there I learned, that was my first experience with fried bread. And as a history student, I was like, well, you guys didn't have cows. How did this become a thing? And that's when I first learned about, like, oh, we were basically forced to eat this, essentially. It was
Absolutely.
They could make. So that's my question is, what work, if any, has been done by the Biden administration, or have you done with them?
Well, I think that the work is moving rather slow, but we are working directly with the USDA, and we have been working directly with the FDPIR program, which is the Federally Distributed Indian Relief, whatever the acronym is, sorry, but FDPIR. And they had us do a bunch of videos to showcase ways to kind of indigenize some of their food offerings. But the issue is the only way to indigenize their food offerings is to get rid of their foods and just use indigenous foods, right? But we still did the project, so we were able to utilize products from the commodity food list and create more indigenous kind of focused recipes for them. And we actually are meeting with a youth summit there in DC in a couple of weeks. But really the issue is, what I see is that they have to revamp the whole situation, because the FDP, the commodity food program in the original days came around shortly after the Great Depression, and it gave the government a way to create a surplus of foods to be able to help purchase foods from all of these homesteaders that were placed out there, between the late 1800s and that period, and to help support some of these family farms to exist. But then as the industrialized food movement comes in, a lot of those small farmer contracts are taken over by larger contracts from the U.S. government, and then this food just becomes a cheaper and cheaper kind of situation. But this food is going to hospitals, to schools, to military, and to native indigenous communities, right? So the issue is that the food became so cheap. Obviously, a lot of you have seen it because you've grown up with it in some form or manner, whether it's in school systems or whatnot, but it's not the best food. So what has to happen is the U.S. government needs to be able to purchase indigenous products from indigenous producers and redistribute those pieces back into that region. But they have to break the United States up into regions if they're going to do it properly. Because, for example, they brought in true wild rice from Minnesota, purchasing from one of the tribes a few years back, and they were very excited about introducing an indigenous product into the commodity food program, right? But the issue was that the demand of how much they needed to fulfill their order was so gigantic that it tapped out most of the rice in Minnesota, and it drove the price. So when I first started the sous chef in 2014, I was purchasing rice on a wholesale level for $3 to $4 a pound. Today, I'm lucky to get it at $15 to $18 a pound. And as an elder in their own community in White Earth Reservation, it was $2 a pound if you're an elder. Today, it's $10. So that's 5 times what it used to be just a few years ago as a direct result from the USDA mismanaging the purchase of this particular piece. So if they broke it up regionally and just gave that wild rice to Great Lakes region where that people understand what that rice is and have an affiliation with it, then it wouldn't wouldn't create that huge demand, and it wouldn't tap it out, and the prices can come back down and make it more accessible. Because people in the Southeast or the Southwest, they don't know what the fuck to do with wild rice anyways because it's not their food, right? So you just have to think really, we have to understand how to really think about everything on a bigger scale when it comes down to it. There are solutions out there. Government is a really slow-moving boat, when it comes down to it. And it's also very mercurial, so it could change within just a few years constantly, So for us, we decided to do our work kind of around the scope of being reliant on governments or politicians to make changes for us, but just get out there and do the work. And hopefully the government can follow and make things happen if we lay some groundwork down first.
Hi. I was wondering what exactly it means to be a forager, and if that looks different in different tribes.
I would say that indigenous peoples around the globe had that ability to understand and identify plants and trees and everything around them to utilize for food, for medicine, for crafting, because we have such a deep connection and relationship with so many of these plants around us. They're tied in and woven to our religions, to our creation stories, you name it. We just have such deep connection to a lot of plants out there, right? And so it's not just about foraging, because it's really just about a way of life of being connected. And so many tribes that didn't utilize agricultural practices per se still utilize permacultural practices in some manner, because they helped maintain and tend the land around them to make sure that they were producing enough food and giving all the respect back that's needed to make sure they had rather healthy, large wild crops growing around them with plants that really grew well. So you see all the acorn trees in California, the camas root, the manzanita trees, for example, if you're near those kinds of regions. Like, they were very clean forests. And if you look at historical references of what the forest looks like here in the East Coast, like, they were highly curated. There were huge paths for people to move around, because the forest was a part. Not only do they have agriculture here, but they still had that really vibrant ethnobotanical viewpoint of the world around them, of how to utilize everything, So they had to curate and tend everything. And I think that the westernized approach to foraging still carries that very colonial perspective of extracting for profit, because people want to monetize it somehow. They want to make money off it somehow. They want to create a product out of it, which is fine. It's a form of capitalism, but it doesn't necessarily to mean that, because we don't have to put a monetary value on food every single time. Like, we could work hard as a community, as a group, to create food for everybody if we really needed to. Because again, there's just outside solutions and different perspectives to look at things.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for coming. I was just wondering about how recipes were shared over generations, as to whether it was oral histories or written histories, and then also just a bit about your focus specifically at your restaurant. Do you focus on those recipes, or also kind of connecting how you can use older ingredients to connect with maybe more modern styles of cooking?
Yeah, because we're not attempting to cook like 1491. We're not trying to be in the past. We're trying to be present in the future and trying to move forward. So we really literally are trying to evolve this food into the next situation. So we are very aware of a lot of traditional recipes that are out there, but a lot of those recipes are typically tied with a lot of ceremonial and very personal and sacred kind of relationships that a lot of different groups out there have. And in order to respect some of those, we choose not to do a lot of those traditional recipes directly directly, and instead try to put a manipulation or twist on some of the recipes to make them a little bit more modernized, to be a little bit more creative with them. So we do our best to not disrespect somebody in a community someplace when it comes down to it. But it's there's so much creativity that we can have, and we really just try to stay in the framework that we developed in the beginning, which is just, first off, cutting away colonial ingredients, and then just focusing on with what's around us. But there's also gray lines because some things have been introduced and are now part of our environment. So when it comes to things like dandelion or plantain, where we don't know exactly the perfect time frame of when that gets introduced onto this continent, but they're here around us now, so we have to decide what is our relationship with these plants moving forward. And it's better, like if we have invasive species that are just trying to take over too much space, maybe just eating them could be the best solution for them instead of poisoning the ground with chemicals to try to make them go away.
Thank you.
Julia, there's a question. Okay. Julia? There's a question there. After.
Hi. Firstly, I really wanted to thank you for coming and speaking us today. I personally feel very moved by your presentation. I have a couple of questions, both of which are in the same vein. Firstly, I'd like to ask how you found yourself in this line of work in advocacy. And secondly, I'd like to ask what we as students and average citizens can do to support you in this.
I would say for myself, how I ended up here is just because, I tried to tell the story a little bit in the presentation, but, I grew up on a reservation. I grew up rather poor. I started working in restaurants at a young age, which was very comfortable because they were warm places to work and there was a lot of food access that I could have, which was better than some of the other jobs I had taken when I was younger. But really, it just became a matter of when I actually did become a chef in a city, and I had learned food from all over the place. My first chef job was at a Spanish restaurant, and then my second job was at a sushi restaurant, and I just kept learning all these different styles of cooking. And then all of a sudden, I had the epiphany of why don't I know anything about my own heritage when it came to indigenous foods, and why are there no books out there? Why are there no famous chefs of indigenous peoples out there or anything like that, So it just set me on a path to try and understand, and I had to be a spokesperson. So when I'm doing all this work, it's not about me trying to become a famous chef, because so many of the culinary and restaurant projects out there are literally just ego projects when it comes down to it, which is fine because typically the chefs are the artists showcasing their perspective and their viewpoint and their artistry. But for me, this is something larger than I can ever attain to be, so I have to utilize these platforms to be able to reach a lot more people. And that was the purpose of opening up a restaurant, was knowing that it could just be a showcase place, to really to show people what is possible moving forward and what is a decolonized restaurant, what can it look like, and hopefully somebody can come around me and do it better than me in the future, So I just want to get this out there, and I just feel like I have to, responsibly I have to use this platform to be able to talk about this, because people invite me to talk about native foods and they want to hear it, but I kind of feel like I have to give them this colonial history approach to really truly understand why there aren't native restaurants out there everywhere.
Hi, thank you again for coming. I was fascinated by your presentation and also about the idea of Indigenous education. And I understand that a lot of it is founded upon thousands of years of tradition. And as an outsider, I was wondering how I can learn more about what you talked about without being intrusive to Native peoples as an outsider.
I think that we should all just, and obviously to address the other question there, what to do moving forward, I think it's really important to identify some indigenous leaders, some indigenous projects that might be happening in the world around you, and just really try to understand what can you do out there to support that. But part of the work too is just understanding where you might be living at today and truly understanding the indigenous struggle that may have that did happen where you might be standing, especially if you're in North America, and just trying to change your perspective again, because if all you know about American history is what you learned in U.S. history books in high school, you know nothing about U.S. history, So there's really so much that you just have to open your mind up to really look at the perspective of it. And we've never exited the era of colonialism, because they're literally still murdering and displacing and destroying indigenous spaces in Brazil right now, today, as we speak.
So guys, put your hands up so Julia and Pau can see you with your questions, but please, more questions.
Either way.
Yeah.
Well, so you all know I like fermentation, and one of the amazing things that cooking with microbes can do is to change the texture, right? So fermenting dairy is one way you could do this. You take milk, you ferment it, you turn it into yogurt, which has a completely different texture, completely different viscosity. Sorry for being repetitive. So I'm really curious, you mentioned corn milk. Could you tell us a little bit about how that is prepared, and is there a tradition of fermenting corn milk?
So if you, we make a lot of different milks because we're just always experimenting with different things. So we've tried making, plant-based milks out of things like nuts and corn and beans and rice and whatever, and hemp seeds and whatever we can, just to see what happens as we're able to create different things. Because we're basically just trying to create a modern-day sense of what is our indigenous pantry and what are all the ingredients that we can utilize moving forward, knowing that we kind of put ourselves in a very specific framework of thinking, of perspective, right? So when it comes to fermentation in North America, there has been, I've been able to find a little bit of fermentation basically almost everywhere across North America, even though it's been very elusive. So I've found a lot of instances of fermentation of corn products from this region all the way down into Mexico. So there's fermented corns, something as simple as sour corn, which you can find some of those recipes out there still today. There's very, very simple fermented corn mush that you find in some areas. Corn drinks, that is a basic fermentation, almost making like a corn beer in a very simple situation, which I believe is called chicha. And then there's the other one, one name of it, I should say, because again, there's so much diversity out there. So there's many names for many things when it comes down to it. But there's also fermentation of maple, fermentation of fruits. You see a lot of desert fruits and desert plants being fermented all across the Southwest throughout Mexico. Across the northern California, all the way up into Alaska, we see lots of instances of fermented sea creatures, whether they're things like salmon eggs, seaweeds, seals, whale. And again, those kind of mimic a lot of fermented fish product that you see on the other side of the ocean even. So there's just a lot of fermentation instances out there, and it's definitely worth exploring. But again, because of the erasure of so much indigenous education and knowledge, it is very elusive. But again, I have been able to find certain instances which would be fun and is fun to be able to experiment with, to be able to learn more about different varietals of how different varietals of corn might act because of the different sugar contents and pieces like that. And I think there's a lot to explore moving forward to truly understand and try to recover a lot of indigenous knowledge moving forward.
Hi there. Oh, sorry. I was really struck during your talk by how using and incorporating ingredients that are native and seasonal really feels like a different recipe paradigm than like the French tradition that says no matter where you are in the world, you have to get wheat flour and put that into your recipe. And so I'm wondering, incorporating these practices into your cooking, does this change the way that you think about recipes?
Absolutely, because I think if you look at fry bread, it's a really good example of colonial influence on indigenous communities, and it would be the same thing if you look at a banh mi compared to, Vietnamese cooking, right? It's a colonial influence coming in and showcasing it. And it's also just thinking about the migration of food and how that's happened throughout human history. What would Northern Europe look like without potatoes, which was only a few hundred years ago, right? Or what about Northern Italy before Marco Polo, before they had pasta, before they had tomato sauce, before they had polenta, and some of these things that they really take into as traditional foods today, and just thinking about all this migration of food that happens on a larger scale. So I think it's really important to think about it no matter where you are in the world, to think about what's really truly unique to the very particular region that you might be living in.
So I have a question.
Yes, sir.
You make this really excellent point that your restaurant doesn't live in the past. It wants to take things in the future, or in the present, and make them into indigenous foods. What's the future? Where's some really cool directions you're going to go?
Well, I just really believe that we can really open up people's minds to really understand the true value of indigenous peoples moving forward. The vast knowledge that indigenous peoples still hold on a global scale that is still in danger right now today if we don't do something about it. And it's in danger of we are in danger of losing more of it that we've already lost, primarily because of the colonial history that happens on a global scale. So it's really important that we understand how much of a deeper relationship we could have with the world around us, how more sustainable and resourceful we could utilize by adopting indigenous practices and methods into our everyday life, no matter what it might be. But just opening up a different perspective of education for people to see the two, to be able to choose between the two, and also just giving us another option. So it's not always the colonial westernized approach to everything, but there's actually so many different viewpoints out there. And indigenous is a very ambiguous and broad term because it can include anybody, anywhere, really, when it comes down to it. But it's very specific to think about the first peoples, especially peoples who are marginalized by colonial practices, and what we can gain by listening to them for once in history.
But what's the next dish you're going to add to your restaurant that brings something like around you that's not necessarily indigenous, but using the new kinds of foods that you find?
Well, I mean,
can you share something about that?
Well, if I understand the question, I guess, we're always being really creative. We're always utilizing indigenous farmers around us, indigenous proteins around us. Some of the items we buy are ingredients that were introduced, but that are commonplace, And I think it's just, again, it's important that as we work actually to helping to support and develop other tribal communities to develop their own food operations, that we allow them to identify what their foods might be. Some of them might include fry bread, and there's nothing wrong with that. I feel like indigenous peoples on a global scale need the opportunity to take a moment to define what their foods are. Because so many times we've seen white European descendant chefs coming in and claiming and utilizing terms like, oh, we just discovered the food of Oaxaca, and now I'm bringing it to this new gentrified area. And that kind of language is just dangerous, because nobody wants to be discovered when you're just living there already, right? So we just have to really, really think things through, but allow indigenous people and people of color to have their voice, to be able to really create what their future is moving forward and not be told what their future is or what their past was. And so much of the academic research that I've had to look through, especially when it comes to ethnobotany, comes from that very westernized academic where it doesn't include that deep connection that we have with foods, the stories that are behind them. Usually if you look up an ethnobotanical text and you look up something like I don't know, a hickory nut or something, it'll say something on the lines of Native Americans used this piece for food, for medicine, for crafting, and Europeans used it to make wine out of or something. It would be very simplistic is all I'm saying. So my point is that I just want you guys to think about the different perspectives that are out there. But there's all sorts of creativity out there. Like we have a really creative culinary team. I had 120 employees at the restaurant this summer, and we have a really rather large culinary team. And with the team over at the Food Lab, who gets freedom to create and do a lot of research and development, that there's just so much that can come out of this. But we're just beginning. We're unfortunately the only restaurant like this out there in the entire nation.
Thank you so much. So I love to cook, and I've also lived here my entire life. And so just wondering if you have any ideas of recipes that people have used that just use locally sourced ingredients from around here that were maybe here before colonization.
Well, you guys have so much here because you have everything that's in the ocean. You have all the lobsters and quahogs and clams and mussels and all the stuff that's out, and all the different kinds of seaweeds and sea plants that are out there. You have the coastal, there's all sorts of roses and rose hips. You guys have papas out here. We don't have that, You have just a bunch of cool tree nuts and fruits. There's just all sorts of stuff. So it's just thinking about what's here, what grows here naturally, what's in the forest, what's in the sea, what kind of sea mammals are out there, what kind of mollusks are out there, what kind of sea creatures, what kind of land animals would be natural to this area, what kind of wild birds or wild fish or whatever it might be. It's just thinking about the land that you're on. And then on top of that, you're thinking about the tribal communities and are there still indigenous peoples growing some of the heirloom varietals of agricultural pieces? And there are. You're lucky that there still are some tribal communities, especially some of the tribal communities that got pushed into Canada in the late 1700s, still have maintained a lot of their seed stock when it comes down to it. So there are a lot of cool resources out there, and it's just connecting with some of the people to really showcase what are the true foods of this area and starting to learn some of the true languages, because you see the languages everywhere as you're traveling around. It's in the state names, it's in the city names, it's in street names. It's just around us, and we just have to be aware of what those mean and just make it more of our education.
Okay, maybe one last question at the back there.
So you spent a lot of the early part of the presentation discussing the history of policies, presidential, attitudes, and statements and executive orders and such like, and the ways that they impacted indigenous communities and shaped the cuisine. I mean, do you have any thoughts on like current policies or what's going on in like the national government or local state governments that's like currently impacting indigenous peoples and the way their cuisine is growing? I mean, you mentioned already the USDA, but I don't know, is there anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of factors. I think that there are so many tribal communities that were given governance, and they were always set up to fail because they basically do the very democratic thing of having 4-year terms, and then after 4 years, somebody else can, bid to be the next person. But typically, there's zero training when it comes to understanding governmental roles, because like governments are really complex things to understand, and budgets are really complicated things to deal with. So a lot of times, what we see in tribal community is somebody gets elected based off of popularity, and they don't really have the education or background to know how to manage, and there ends up being a lot of nepotism, and they're hiring a lot of friends and families to run everything, and then everything just continues on this very negative cycle. And we just see so much of that happening through history. And I feel like Native nations really need to be unified when it comes down to it, because we're all kind of in this together. We are the original peoples of this land space, and we should be connected with not only unified with people within the colonial states, which are the US, Canada, and Mexico, but also connected to each other as indigenous peoples too, because we've all been facing the exact same things for so long that we should have larger voices. We should have representatives in Congress or the Senate or something like that to represent all indigenous peoples, because typically it's been like a Republican from North Dakota that literally oversees all of Indian country, and that's insane. So like we have to really think better of who our voices, who really gets to have our voice as indigenous peoples. But again, it has to work towards some way being unified, because we cannot rely on politicians or the government to make the necessary changes. They just never will.
Okay, one last question, hidden away in the back, but keep it short.
Yeah. Well, sorry. I don't know how this works. I was just wondering if you have like a couple recommendations of books to get started, like learning about indigenous food histories and things like that.
Indigenous foods? I couldn't hear that.
Food histories, or
I would tell everybody to read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz first, just the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. It's really intense, but it basically describes the history and the treatment of indigenous peoples, and really kind of formulates how U.S. militarism is formed. She has another book called Loaded, which just talks about guns, but it really goes through the really violent history to understand things. But I think it's really important because it's all about removing indigenous peoples from land, and especially in the beginning or up until the middle 1800s, holding on to and controlling a lot of indigenous peoples from Africa to force build a lot of this situation too. But I think that you should definitely read Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden as that unique perspective to just what an indigenous farmer perspective looks like in the middle of North America. There's another one from author W.B. Waugh, and I think it's just called The Foods of the Iroquois. That's an older one at the turn of the century. It's a non-indigenous writer, but he records a lot of really useful information for this particular area. And there's other cookbooks that are slowly coming out on the subject. And I just think Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer is a really important one too. And I know there's more, so I guess I'll try and think of some more.
Okay, so before we stop, we're giving out the exams. So at the end of the class, find your TF either at the back or at the front to pick up your exam. And now let's thank Sean really one more time.
Thank you, guys.